Hello, true crime lovers! Hope you're having a great week and staying happy and healthy. I'm Julia, and today's story will teach you not to judge a book by its cover. And by that, I mean those who appear totally innocent may not be who or what they seem. Today, I'm going to be telling you the story of Dorothea Puente, otherwise known as the Death House Landlady. Here we go. Dorothea Helen Gray was born in Redlands, California on January 9, 1929, to alcoholic parents Trudy May and Jesse James Gray. She was just months old when the stock market crashed, thus starting the era known as the Great Depression. And being the sixth out of 7 children, her family struggled to even put food on the table. Her father, Jesse James Gray, was a World War I veteran who suffered from the long-term effects of a gas attack on the front lines of France. As a result, his lungs were incredibly damaged. He came back from the war very frail and very depressed. According to the LA Times, he would often talk about suicide in front of his children, and sometimes even held a gun to his head while doing so. Dorothea's mother also didn't provide much nurturing or parental leadership. Trudy was a sex worker and would often neglect and abandon her children for days at a time. The children were often left to fend for themselves and even find their own food. When Dorothea was 8 years old, her father passed away from tuberculosis, and soon after was taken out of the care of her mother, who was often getting arrested for petty crimes and was never around to look after her children. Dorothea and her 6 siblings were separated into different orphanages and foster homes. Not long after Trudy lost custody of her kids in 1938, she was killed in a motorcycle accident. Dorothea was officially an orphan. I also just wanted to mention that it was hard to know what details about Dorothea were true because she lied so often. I did see an article that said Dorothea lost her parents around the age of 4 and 6, but after checking in numerous books and credible news articles, it was said her parents did in fact die when she was 8 and 10. That is just one of the many details that is a bit fuzzy in her story. Actually, while I'm at it, another lie that Dorothea told later in life was that she was actually one out of 18 children who were all born and raised in Mexico. However, this one was determined to be a lie. Like I said before, she was one of 7 children born in California. Anyway, the remainder of her childhood, Dorothea was tossed around from orphanages and foster homes and to relatives. She was also reportedly sexually abused while at one of the orphanages. So in 1945, at age 16, after living with some relatives, Dorothea made her way by herself to Olympia, Washington. She turned to sex work to get by and went by the name of Sherry while on the streets. It was at this time that she caught the eye of 22-year-old World War II soldier Fred McFall, who had just recently returned from war. I know that now a 22-year-old being with a 16-year-old sounds super creepy, but this was the 40s, so it probably wasn't a big deal. Months after meeting, the two were married. However, apparently on her marriage certificate, she states she was 30 at the time, which would mean she was born in 1915. This too was found to be a lie, as like I said, she was 16. But you can kind of see that she thinks lying is no big deal, especially if she's doing it on a legal document. Throughout her marriage to Fred, the lies continued. She told him she used to be a Hollywood actress. She even claimed she had survived the atomic bombing in Hiroshima back in August 1945. So her lies weren't little white lies or exaggerated stories. I think maybe because her early life was so hard, she coped with it by making up different pasts for herself. Fred and Dorothea moved to Nevada and the couple had 2 daughters, although the couple kept neither of the 2 babies. One was raised by McFall's relatives, while the other one was given up for adoption. In a later interview, Dorothea says that she had had twin daughters who both committed suicide as adults, but as far as we know, Dorothea didn't actually raise any children. In 1948, it's reported that Fred McFall left Dorothea. To avoid embarrassment, or maybe to get sympathy, she told police he had actually died of a heart attack. However, Fred McFall was interviewed about his ex-wife later in 1988 and was alive and well. After this, newly, quote, widowed Dorothea moved to San Bernardino, where she had her first run-in with the law. She was arrested for forging checks, but only served 4 months before being let out on probation. As soon as she got out of prison, she fled the area. This was technically against her probation, but since she was only a petty criminal, the police didn't exactly chase her down. She then had another child with a one-night stand, and again gave up the baby for adoption. But in 1952, Dorothea got married for a second time to Swedish immigrant Axel Johansson. Despite the very turbulent relationship, the two were married for 14 years. Dorothea's constant drinking and gambling put strain on the marriage, and it was reported that Dorothea would leave for days at a time, sometimes with other men, while her husband had no idea where she was. The two often got into violent brawls, but years later, Dorothea is quoted saying Axel was very good to her, so I don't know if it ever got physically abusive. Fast forward 8 years to 1960, when Dorothea is arrested again, this time for running a brothel. An undercover cop had come by what Dorothea disguised as a bookkeeping service. But when Dorothea offered him some of her services, she was arrested. She was, however, able to get her sentence knocked down to a, quote, found-in charge, which basically means she got in trouble for taking part in the brothel, but not necessarily running it. Dorothea claims she was simply visiting a friend. For this, she got away with only 90 days in jail. In the mid-60s, Dorothea got a job as a nurse's aide, caring for the disabled and elderly, before eventually getting a job managing boarding houses and in-house caretaking. I think this was probably when she realized the vulnerability of these types of people. While she was finally making money for herself, her marriage was falling apart. In 1966, Axel filed for divorce, but this was no worry for Dorothea. Later that year, she meets husband number 3, a man by the name of Roberto Puente, hence her last name, Dorothea Puente. He was a Mexican immigrant and 19 years her junior. Although the marriage only lasted 2 years, she decided to keep his last name. It was around this time that Dorothea bought a 16-room Victorian mansion at 2100 F Street in Sacramento and turned it into a boarding house. As I said before, she had spent a lot of time in the previous years caring for the elderly, as well as alcoholics, so she figured she could open up her own boarding house for the same type of people. The house earned attention because it was pretty extravagant for a boarding house. Each bedroom had their own bathroom, and because Dorothea was very into appearances, she put a color TV in each room as well, which was not common at that time at all. To become known and popular in the community and industry, she again told lies. She told people she used to be friends with the First Lady. Another lie of hers was that she was a nurse in World War II. She managed all of her tenants' money and bills, including their social security checks and government assistance checks. She claimed she did this so that they wouldn't go blow the money on booze. All of her tenants were vulnerable people, and everyone thought this was just Dorothea's way of giving them some guidance. What she was really doing was stealing. Dorothea cashed many of her tenants' checks into her own account and used the money to buy expensive clothes, get her hair done, and to further keep up her good reputation. She would often host large holiday dinners where she would invite all the social workers to join. She donated to charity as well. She was a real socialite in the community. On top of her gentle and giving nature, she was praised for taking in alcoholics, drug addicts, and the disabled and elderly. During this time, Dorothea took in and actually helped many young Hispanic girls from troubled families. She sometimes funded their schooling and just generally took care of them. Sometimes she even introduced them as her daughters, though she never actually adopted them. This could be seen as one of the times that there was some good in Dorothea. Perhaps she saw herself in these girls. So while her boarding house is going really well, she meets her fourth and final husband, Pedro Montalvo. Pedro wasn't exactly a catch, though. He was a raging and violent alcoholic, and the two divorced just months after they were married. After her fourth divorce, she began to hang out around bars to meet older men who were receiving benefits, and got into the habit of forging their signatures to steal their money. But then, in 1978, Dorothea got in trouble once again. One of her former tenants had gone to jail, and even though he no longer lived at Dorothea's, she continued to cash his Social Security checks. An investigation found that Dorothea had stolen over $4,000 from her tenants and the men she met at the bar, and was charged with 34 counts of fraud. Amazingly, she got away with just 5 years of probation and counseling. I mean, hey, she was a little old lady who ran a house for the vulnerable and gave to charity. What judge was going to send her to jail? As part of her probation, though, she was of course required to give up her boarding house at 2100 F Street. Because her reputation had now been tarnished, she left town for about a year until everyone stopped talking about her and kind of forgot what happened. She attended her counseling where she was diagnosed as an undifferentiated schizophrenic, meaning she didn't really have all the symptoms of a specific type of schizophrenia, so she's more just a general categorization. A year later, in 1979, Dorothea returned to Sacramento under the name of her fourth husband. She now went by Dorothea Montalvo. She rented an apartment at 1426 F Street, just down the street from her previous boarding house. This would be the infamous apartment where she would start her killing spree. Since she wasn't allowed to have a boarding house as part of her probation, she decided to work with the elderly on a smaller scale. She was able to pass herself off as a private trained nurse and live-in caretaker for many elderly patients. One of these patients was an elderly woman by the name of Esther Busby. Shortly after being in Dorothea's care, Esther had begun to frequently be admitted to the hospital, often with coma-like symptoms. The strange thing was, though, once doctors stabilized her and sent her home, she was back again in a few days with the same symptoms. Shortly after this all started, Esther's social worker learned that Dorothea was always there when Esther was sent to the hospital. Upon doing a little digging, she then learned that Dorothea had been calling Esther's relatives, saying she needed more money for Esther's in-house care because Esther had been diagnosed with cancer. This was all entirely untrue. After this, Dorothea was fired. But during the early 80s, Dorothea's file started to show a pattern. At least 4 of her patients had suffered from new health problems, which would often come very sudden and only under Dorothea's care. The police were never contacted, though, as some say there wasn't enough evidence to call police. But I also think that nobody actually wanted to be the one to accuse an old lady of murder. Dorothea was actually only in her 50s at this time, but looked much older. She had white hair, was overweight, and had bad teeth that could have easily made her look like she was in her 70s. She had also been telling people that she was dying of cancer and got lots of sympathy for that. This, again, was not true. So things continued on, and in April 1982, Dorothea got a roommate, 61-year-old Ruth Monroe, her so-called friend and work partner. The two apparently worked in a lunchroom together, maybe at one of the elderly homes or something. I'm not too sure where they met, but the two struck up a friendship. Ruth's husband, a former veteran, was terminally ill in a hospital nearby, and Ruth felt having a roommate could help her save some money. She also just wanted some company after seeing her husband in such bad condition in the hospital. But shortly after Ruth moved in, she was dead. Her death report states she died of an overdose of codeine and Tylenol. Dorothea explained to police that Ruth had been very depressed after her husband had fallen terminally ill. Police were pretty nonchalant about the incident and ruled it a suicide. The truth about Ruth's death wouldn't come out until years later, even though her family had begun to get suspicious. At first, they noticed Ruth getting weaker and weaker, but Dorothea had convinced everyone she was a nurse, so the family felt Ruth was in good hands. It wasn't until later, when they found out Dorothea had been draining Ruth's bank accounts, that they finally became suspicious. Even with this evidence, though, police upheld their ruling of suicide. This is really sad also because if Dorothea had been caught then, many lives could have been saved. After the death of Ruth Monroe, you would think Dorothea would lay low for a bit. But no. Police were back at Dorothea's house just a few weeks later. 74-year-old Malcolm Mackenzie had told police that Dorothea had drugged and robbed him. The two had recently met at a bar and then gone back to Malcolm's apartment afterward, where Dorothea slipped something in his drink and robbed him. The thing is, though, that the drug didn't completely knock him out. It just made him unable to move, so he actually remembered everything that happened and had to sit there helplessly while he watched Dorothea take his things. Apparently, she even took his ring right off of his finger. With this, Dorothea was put back in prison and sentenced to 5 years behind bars. While in prison, Dorothea struck up a pen pal relationship with a 77-year-old retiree, Everson Gilmouth. For some reason, maybe loneliness, I'm not sure, Everson liked writing to prison inmates and was immediately taken with Dorothea. He told her he was living off his pension checks, and that pretty much sealed the deal. Soon, the two had made plans to get married, and when Dorothea was released after 3 years for good behavior in 1985, Everson was there to pick her up. But after that, Everson disappeared. But of course, Dorothea continued to cash his pension checks. She even wrote to his family pretending to be Everson, saying that he couldn't get in contact with them because he had been ill. But in 1986, his badly decomposed, unidentifiable body was discovered in a homemade coffin washed up on the riverbank. Though the body wasn't determined to be his until 1988, and I'll get more into that later. After Everson's murder, Dorothea was looking for new victims and a new source of income. Against the rules of her probation, she again opened up a boarding house in her apartment at 1426 F Street. As a condition of her probation, Dorothea was not allowed to run a boarding house and was given strict instructions to stay away from the elderly and was also not allowed to handle any government checks. But of course, she didn't take any of this seriously. Again, she preyed on what investigators referred to as shadow people. Elderly, alcoholics and drug users, the disabled, people who may have not had family or anyone to actually notice that they went missing. And just like before, to social workers who didn't know her past, this showed them that Dorothea was an empathetic, compassionate old lady eager to help others. During these years, probation officers did 14 visits to her house, but apparently never knew that the apartment had been turned into a boarding home. They only saw a polite, friendly, little old lady. As time went on, many of her residents disappeared without a trace, but it wasn't until the disappearance of a mentally handicapped 50-year-old tenant named Bert Montoya that Dorothea was exposed. Bert was a diagnosed schizophrenic who talked to the voices in his head, but he had a very childlike nature, kind of like a gentle giant. His social worker, Judy Moyes, had heard about Dorothea's boarding house and her reputation of taking in troubled or disabled tenants, and so Bert moved into Dorothea's boarding home in April of 1988. According to Judy, Bert blossomed under Dorothea's watch and care. But then, in November 1988, Judy couldn't find Bert at the boarding home when she came to check up. Dorothea told the social worker that Bert had packed up and gone down to Mexico, but not to worry, as he would be back soon. I imagine Judy found this suspicious, but either way, she waited. Weeks passed and there was still no Bert, so Judy decided to check in again, but there was no update on his whereabouts. Dorothea now stated that one of Bert's relatives had come to pick up his stuff and that Bert was now with his family. This just didn't really add up for Judy, and she reports him missing to the police. Police kind of take this with a grain of salt. Like, okay, a mentally ill person is missing, and he's apparently run off with his family. Unfortunately, it wasn't really top priority, and that's exactly why Dorothea chose these kind of victims. But police go to Dorothea's house at 1426 F Street, and there they talk to her hired chef, John Sharp. Sharp tells officers Dorothea had been telling him to keep quiet about Bert and lie if he had to. He also tells police that Dorothea would guard it in the middle of the night, as well as kind of just all about the strange activity about all the other tenants disappearing. Coincidentally, after a tenant disappeared, there was always a new hole recently dug in the backyard. After this information, police pulled up Dorothea's file, and that's when they discovered she was in fact on probation and shouldn't even had a boarding house in the first place. They also saw her history of drugging and robbing the elderly. Upon further investigation, police discovered that, contrary to what Dorothea had been telling social workers, she was only 59 and completely healthy. I mentioned before she had purposely been trying to make herself look older and more fragile, so she would appear unsuspecting. It was approximately 10 a.m. on November 11, 1988, when homicide detectives went to 1426 F Street to question Dorothea. It was Veterans Day, a federal holiday in the U.S., so the street was very quiet and peaceful. When police arrived at her door, Dorothea was incredibly welcoming. She immediately invited them inside and even offered the officers some coffee. After a few questions, they asked if they could search her yard. Dorothea replied that would be no problem, adding in that they would need to be careful about her flowers, though. I feel like she said this just to make herself seem more innocent. So as they dug, Dorothea observed, seeming cool, calm, and collective. But later that day, the first body was found, which would later be determined as the body of 78-year-old Leona Carpenter. When police pulled out a femur bone, Dorothea covered her mouth with her hand and appeared horrified. She told police she would take a lie detector test on Monday after the holiday weekend, and again, tried to make herself seem innocent. As the second day of digging began, Dorothea said she needed to calm down and go get a cup of coffee at a nearby store. So police let her. They said they had only found partial remains of one body, and they had no idea how long it had been there and no identification yet. So they couldn't really determine Dorothea had something to do with it. Again, I think this shows how she fooled everyone. They found a body in her yard and they're going to let her go by herself to buy a cup of coffee? I'm not sure why she wasn't arrested immediately after finding the first body. So, as some of you may have seen coming, by the time the second body was found, Dorothea was already in a cab and starting her escape. Over the next 3 days, 7 mummified bodies, wrapped in bed sheets, plastics, and tape, were found in the backyard. The victims were later identified as 78-year-old Leona Carpenter, 64-year-old alcoholic Dorothy Miller, 55-year-old alcoholic Benjamin Fink, 78-year-old Betty Palmer, whose corpse was missing a head, feet, and hands, 62-year-old James Gallup, who at the time of his death was recovering from a brain tumor surgery, 64-year-old Vera Faye Martin, who investigators believe could have been actually buried alive, and finally, the man who started the search, 50-year-old Bert Montoya. Police then searched to see if there were any other bodies that had been found lately that were mummified in the same particular way, with duct tape and bedsheets, and they began looking into the discovery of the body wrapped up and found in a box near the river bend 2 years prior. Upon these discoveries, Dorothea was also charged with the murder of Ruth Monroe and the man found in a box against the riverbank, who now had been identified as Everson Gilmouth. But police were still missing Dorothea Puente. It was the weekend of American Thanksgiving when officers received a call from a man named Charlie Wilkes. Charlie, a man in his 60s living off Social Security checks, informed him he had just met a woman named Donna Johansson at a bar in LA. She had told him that she was staying in the Royal Viking Hotel, and her husband had just died, and that's why she had moved to LA for a fresh start. The two had even made plans to have Thanksgiving dinner together later in the week. But when Charlie got home, he saw Dorothea on the TV and pieced together that Donna Johansson was actually Dorothea Puente. Also note that Johansson was the name of her second husband, the Swedish guy. With this tip, police surround room 31 at the Royal Viking Hotel and arrest Dorothea Puente. Although she admitted to stealing the check money, Dorothea was adamant that she never killed anybody. On February 9th, 1993, Dorothea went to trial for 9 counts of murder. The trial actually had to be moved away from Sacramento in order to get a fair trial because the case was so sensationalized there, and they didn't want this to affect the jury in any way. Despite the victims being found in the backyard, it was still a challenge to prove Dorothea had murdered them, as the victims' causes of death couldn't be determined after being in the ground for so long. However, the drug Dalmane, used to treat insomnia, was found in all the victims' systems. Her defense argued that the victims had died of natural causes, and she buried them to cover up the boarding house, as it was against her parole. But this still left a lot of unanswered questions. In August 1993, Dorothea was found guilty in the murders of Benjamin Fink, Dorothy Miller, and Leona Carpenter. The other 6 murders resulted in a mistrial, with 11 jurors voting guilty and 1 juror firmly not budging on his not guilty vote. Though I'm not sure why he voted guilty in 3 of them, but not the remaining 6. The prosecution wanted the death penalty, but one article actually stated that putting Dorothea to death would be like executing your own grandmother. On October 13th, 1993, Dorothea was sentenced to 2 life sentences plus 25 years. Dorothea Puente was incarcerated at the Central California Women's Facility for the rest of her life. After her conviction, she came out with a cookbook in 2004 titled Cooking with a Serial Killer, featuring 50 of her best comfort food recipes. She maintained her innocence until her death on March 27, 2011, at the age of 82. Her cause of death was determined to be of natural causes. So, what happened to the house at 1426 F Street? In 2010, couple Tom Williams and Barbara Holmes bought the infamous house. They were, of course, aware of the history when they bought it, but didn't let it bother them. They cope with the house's past by making light of the dark situation. They have a sign on the front porch that says, "Trespassers will be drugged and buried in the backyard." There is also a mannequin resembling Dorothea in the backyard that holds a shovel. Owner Tom says that humor is great for healing. They're a really interesting couple, whether you think that their new additions to the house are funny or disrespectful. They did an interview and tour of the house with The Atlantic, and I'll include that video in the podcast description if you want to go watch it. In 2018, the house was available, one day only, for a tour. Tickets were $25, and yes, lots of people attended. All money raised that day was donated to a homeless shelter to protect the kind of people Dorothea preyed on. The couple also claim that almost every day, people come by to take pictures of the house, and tourists regularly try to get a look at the back garden. For years, many have cited Eileen Wuornos as the first known female serial killer. But what about Dorothea? Even her case is not too well known. But if there's anything to learn from Dorothea Puente, it's that even the ones who appear innocent are capable of having deep, dark secrets. That's it for today's episode, guys. Thanks so much for listening. And if you guys are really bored during this quarantine and are looking for something to do, you can leave me a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts and also all of your other favorite podcasts that you guys listen to. I'm sure the host of the show would really appreciate it. You can also find more updates about cases and pictures of Dorothea Puente on my Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Always Time for True Crime. And I'll see you all next week.